Today, I'm going to help you understand what's really happening behind the sensational headlines of tariffs and trade wars. My guest today is Professor Jeffrey Sachs, a world-renowned economist who has spent decades advising presidents all over the world with a focus on post-communist countries. He actually advised both Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin in Russia in the early 90s. So I couldn't think of a better guy to help me understand the China dynamic in the U.S.-China trade war, something that's lost on most people following these headlines. Now, we cover a lot of ground today, but right at the end, Jeff's going to let you in on the real gem that the global market is competing for, and it's not what the mainstream media is telling you. Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Here is Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, I'm here with Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey, it's great to have you on the program. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise. Thanks a lot for having me.
So here's where I want to spend our time today. I want to get your take firsthand on the escalation of the United States-China conflicts. We're awash in hyperbole and sensational headlines, and a lot of people respond and react to those headlines and make grand assumptions based off of them. But there's a much bigger trend. There's much bigger trends in place, and I want to dig into that nuance with you today. You know, we're clearly in a trade war, but we've been in one for at least a decade. We're in a technology war, but we've been in one for at least a decade, and maybe more recently a geopolitical and a capital war. But from your perspective as our opener, and then I'll just pull on some threads, when you think through the U.S.-China, call it competition or conflict today, what do the majority of people misunderstand? What are they missing, Jeff?
Well, I just think this is part of a very long-term trend. We're at the end of a long period of history where the Western world, and by that we should understand, meaning Britain, Europe, and the United States, dominated the rest of the world. And that's pretty strange because the Western world today is about 335 million people in the United States, about 450 million people in the European Union, another 60 million or so in Britain. You add it all up, it's maybe 11 or 12% of the world population. So there's no real sense in which this part of the world, call it the North Atlantic, it's a better description than the West, should dominate the world. But it did, actually, for hundreds of years, for many centuries. It's a long story. It's the history of the modern world. But that kind of domination is basically ending now. The rise of China as a very strong economy and a military power and a technology force is part of this rise. Before that, Japan became a major non-Western leader of the world economy. People know about that. They know about Korea as well. They know about Taiwan as well, major producer of leading semiconductors. They may know about Singapore, small city-state, but an incredible dynamo. But what we're seeing in general, much beyond even East Asia, is a kind of rebalancing in the world where this big North Atlantic advantage gradually was diminishing. Now it's the gap is diminishing at an even faster rate. India, by the way, the most populous country of the whole world, a little bit bigger than China's, best one can guess on population, is also growing very rapidly. It's a sophisticated country. It's a nuclear power. It's got a lot of technology. So it will be a major force in the world economy. I'd say in 30 years, by some measures, it will be larger than the United States economy. What does it all add up to? As an economist like myself who looks at the long patterns of history, it looks rather normal. But if you're a politician in the United States, it looks like most incredible drama in the world. My God, they're taking over the United States. It's a threat by the Communist Party of China. We're going to go to war. Many hyperbolic assertions made that, again, as somebody who studies history at century scale, I say, well, come on, don't get so excited. This is long-term trend. If I were running for office in a congressional district in Ohio, I might behave differently. But given my approach to the world economy over the last 40 years, which is that I hope every part of the world finds its place in the sun, I don't find what's happening now any grave threat to the United States. I don't find it any cause for war, God forbid. I don't find it any phenomenal drama. I find it rather natural that Asia, which is a great history and almost 60% of the world population, after all, is finding its feet after hundreds of years when it was colonized, ruled by the West, imperialized, bombed by the West, suborned by the West. What's happening now, to my mind, is just fine. Different parts of the world are finding their legs after a long period of Western rule. And I understand that people in the United States may get very nervous about that. In Europe, it's even more fear, by the way. But to my mind, we should just chill a bit, cool down, and avoid war.
Yeah, well, I entirely agree with you there. And if you're right, if you step back and take the century by century viewpoint that you do, you have a few blueprints you can study and then lay over today's landscape. Most recently, obviously, the British and the Dutch, and look at the sunset years of those empires and say how many behaviors and activities are present today. And it kind of rolls it out for you a little bit. To your point, you called it this is natural. This is the natural evolution of an empire. And maybe the budding empires as, I guess, the final Western Christian empire flares out over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Right? There's not another Western Christian empire to replace it like there was with British, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese.
That's a very good point. It went from the Spanish and the Portuguese who led this because they were the first into the Atlantic Ocean. They were the first across the ocean. They were the first around the Cape of Good Hope. And actually in 1494, Pope Alexander divided the world, not between the Europeans and the rest, but he divided the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese. They would own the world, the two of them. And then it took another century, actually, for Holland and Britain to start getting their mojo and to start their overseas empires. Britain eventually dominated the seas. That was the key because, after all, we're talking about transoceanic empires. So France was a land power, but Britain was the naval power. Britain defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. That pushed Spain aside. Britain defeated the Dutch Navy in the 17th century in several Anglo-Dutch wars. That pushed them aside. Suddenly, there was Britain and there was France, one the naval power, one the land power. But the naval power was kind of bound to win because in the end, we're talking about expanding power overseas. Interestingly, Napoleon made an overseas venture to take over the Middle East in 1798. I think I have the date right. And he was defeated by the British Navy. He escaped back to France in the final moment so that he could declare himself a ruler of France and embark on his revolutionary continental wars. But my point is, Britain ruled the oceans by the 19th century, and we say Pax Britannica, Britain ruled the world. It's an interesting phrase, Pax Britannica, British peace. There was no peace. Britain just beat the hell out of everyone else, took over everyone else, so it wasn't peace for the rest of the world, but Britain ruled the world. 2 world wars came, Great Depression, collapse of the British pound in the 1930s, of course, rise of Hitler, Second World War. By the end of that, despite Churchill's, energy and intentions, the British Empire was finished. And the American empire took the baton. We declared it the American century. We thought it would go on forever. I came into this scene, as a professional decades later, because I was born in the 1950s, and I began work in the international sphere in the 1980s, and I became an economic advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990-91 and to Russian President Boris Yeltsin in 1992. So I got to watch a lot of what's happening now very much up close. And I can tell you the mood in the U.S. when the Soviet Union ended in December 1991 was, hey, this isn't just the American century. This is the American millennium. We are the most powerful country in the history of the world, which in some sense of kilotons was true, but not in the sense that other countries had nuclear weapons that could ruin our day at the same time. But in any event, the American leaders thought, my God, we don't have anything close to a rival, an adversary. We can pretty much do what we want in the world. This is now the American-led world. And they couldn't see that a country of rice villages, which China was, by the way, back in 1991, could somehow, in a 34-year period, turn into a major, modern, cutting-edge economy. And if I may, I don't want to ramble, but I can tell you I've been going to China since 1981. And when I first got to China, everyone was in Mao suits and with whisk brooms and bicycles, no private vehicles anywhere. It was an impoverished place. It really was. And it was a place that had been broken by the Cultural Revolution. So it didn't look like it was a rival to the U.S. in any sense. But I've watched over 44 years the rise of a superpower through an incredible amount of hard work, foresight, planning, round-the-clock labor. I mean, people, high saving rates by poor households, scrimping so that they can provide an education for their children. Really remarkable efforts. And I've seen these cities rise from villages before my eyes over a 20 or 30 year period. I was just, and I'll stop my rant here, but I was just in Shenzhen, China, which is the Silicon Valley of China, just adjacent to Hong Kong in southern China in the province of Guangdong. And I was there a couple of weeks ago, and I was visiting robotics factories and all the phenomenal, remarkable things that are being done there. Now, that place, Shenzhen, is now in its metropolitan area about 30 million people. So it's mind-boggling. But amazingly, in the 1980s, it was a village of about 25,000 people. It's grown 1,000 times by a flood of people from all over China coming to this high-tech, high-manufacturing center over a 40-year period. So you see things as an economist you could not see anywhere else in the world, actually. But the long and the short of it is, yeah, they're catching up for lost time. And they're doing a beautiful job of it. And American leaders came to see this as a dire threat about 10 years ago. I don't see the threat, but the rise of China is indisputable.
That's a really interesting point, and I want to pull on that in a minute. There's something else I want to get back to you, but when you talk about the vision, if you were in 1991 in China, you described it as somebody who spent a lot of time there as a nation of rice villages, but it was also a nation with a history and remembered history of being the most powerful, the Celestial Empire, right? This was the most powerful empire in the world. And so that's in the recent memory. We might be rice villages today, but we know what we were, and that's going to impact how we act moving forward. I want
That's exactly right, by the way. And very good. And it's not in the recent memory, it's in the collective memory, I would say, in the sense that it's hundreds of years earlier. But there's a certain, this is something also that I've learned over time because I didn't understand it and didn't appreciate it. And I heard a phrase that I really liked that I had never heard before 2 days ago, civilizational depth. And somebody referred to India and China of having civilizational depth. And what they were saying was that these are places of thousands of years. This isn't some new happenstance. And there's a kind of memory, even if the people don't know the literal history of when the Ming became the Qing, became, the PRC and so forth, if they don't know the dates, there is this sense of grandeur. And the fascinating thing about China, if I may just take a 2-minute digression on it, China was unquestionably the technological leader of the world for about 1,000 years, from 500 AD to 1500 AD. And in the 1420s, so I'm talking about 600 years ago, China had this great imperial fleet of hundreds of huge vessels. It's the fleet of Admiral Zheng He, who's sometimes called the eunuch admiral. And he sailed this fleet around the Indian Ocean, reaching all the way to East Africa. This is in the 1420s and the 1430s. There was nothing like it in the whole world, what China could deploy to the oceans. In 1434, the royal court decided, what do we need this for? We are the celestial kingdom, as you said. We are the center of the universe. We don't need anything from anyone else. We're not really getting anything from anyone else. We should just close up. And by the way, we have marauding tribes coming from our desert north, the so-called steppe regions, invading us from the north. That's where the Great Wall is built. So we should devote our resources to protecting our northern boundaries, not to taking these big naval expeditions. So they scrapped the fleet in 1434. That was the end of the voyages. I call it the worst economic decision in the history of the world because China gave up the oceans. And simultaneously, by coincidence, on the other side of Eurasia was this tiny little kingdom of Portugal and a very clever king, King Henry, who we call Henry the Navigator, who people may remember in school. He started sending these small ships into the Atlantic Ocean and down the western coast of Africa. Why? Because the Turks had impeded overland trade to Asia, and this king presciently was trying to find a sea route to Asia. But China abandoned the oceans. So when the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama circled the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and entered the Indian Ocean and actually made his way through the monsoon winds all the way to India, with the help, by the way, of Arab sailors who knew the routes and the winds, China wasn't there. So the Portuguese didn't confront any naval power. The Europeans discovered the Indian Ocean was open for their vessels, for their pirating, for their cannons. China had closed itself up. And so Europe filled the gap. Of course, the bigger discovery was the accident that going west from Spain, from Seville, led you to the Bahamas, which was Columbus's discovery in the same decade. And that vastly empowered Europe. Suddenly they had two whole continents basically to themselves, because when they brought old world diseases like typhus and bubonic plague and smallpox and so forth, they wiped out the indigenous population substantially. So all of a sudden Europe had two added continents, thank you, to its resource base, its mineral base, its precious metals base, its land base, and so forth. Well, not to go over all of world history. The point is that China led and then kind of disappeared from sight. Within China, from the years 1500 to 1800, China was, still a big economy, and it was a rich economy given the poverty of the whole world. But it was not present in an international sense in any way. And the British tried to force China to trade in a trade mission, so-called, in 1795, the McCarthy mission. The Chinese rebuffed and said, "You kowtow to us. You have nothing we want. You're a bunch of barbarians." And the British came back 3 decades later in 1839 with warships in what's now called the First Opium Wars. And then China basically was attacked for 110 years from the arrival of the British. It suffered multiple invasions, civil war, conquest by Japan in several phases. In other words, disaster that they call the century of humiliation. But what's important for us as Americans especially, and people in the Western world to understand, that really laid China so low, China was bound to bounce back. In other words, China wasn't this impoverished country from history. It was exactly what you said. It was a world-leading society for millennia. And then suddenly for 100 years, they discovered Western technology. They were beaten to hell by it, first by the Europeans and the Americans, and then by their own neighbor, Japan, which industrialized before China. And when China emerged independent in 1949, it was impoverished, and it said, "We've just gone through 110 years of outright humiliation, the century of humiliation." And it's very important to understand that right now, because China's dominant foreign policy idea is, do not do that to us again. Do not divide us. Do not weaken us. Do not rule over us. Do not boss us. We are back, and we are not going to let happen again what the British did to us starting in 1839 and what the Japanese did to us starting in 1895. That's the entire essence of the Chinese worldview right now, which is, don't do that to us again. We are a great country, a great civilization. Now we have a strong economy. Don't mess with us. Of course, and Donald Trump just walked into it. So,
well, I think that's a great segue to what we might call the technology war. And just as an aside, when Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa, I'm pretty sure that was in response to tariffs on the spice trade across the land bridge. There's some irony in today's.
You're exactly right. By the way, it was the fact that in 1453 the Ottomans conquered Constantinople. They renamed it as Istanbul. Suddenly, the Christians didn't have the land route. The Venetians couldn't provide all the services along the Silk Road, and exactly what you said. The Portuguese did not want to pay trade tribute. The Spaniards did not want to pay trade tribute. So they started with the idea, we got to find a sea route somehow, a northern route, a southern route, around Africa, to the west. They tried everything, and they ended up discovering in quotation marks, the indigenous knew they were there, but the Europeans didn't. They discovered the Americas, and they found this Cape of Good Hope, which became the way to enter the Indian Ocean. Exactly what you said.
Right. Just good timeless lessons there about the long-term impact of trade restrictions. They forced innovation. So getting back to innovation, therefore, that journey, Vasco da Gama was was to get access to the Spice Islands, right? The commodity of the day was nutmeg and mace and pepper and whatnot. And competition for access to those islands is what led the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch to develop better, faster ships to get to these lucrative places and get home quicker, right? They could bring more product home faster.
And stronger cannons.
That's it. It was a technology war, and the winner of the technology war got access to the resources. So my question spun off of that is today we're all focused on the tariffs, right? And it's of my view that they're a bit of a sideshow. The real consequential competition is maybe the technology war, right? Which is happening underneath the surface, and we can play trade games. And I want to get into your thoughts on this and how consequential the tariff or the not tariff war really is. You know, how much of this is just theatrics. It's not lost on me that the 90-day delay means the next announcement happens on July 4th, right? Trump understands marketing, if nothing else. But what's your take on that concept that the tariff war, the trade war is becoming a bit of a sideshow? The consequential competition is the technology competition. That's what's led to real growth and prosperity in the past. It will continue in the future. And how does that landscape lay out today?
Yeah, so it's a great set of issues. It is the set of issues, but it also presupposes something that I would say is very much a Western and very much an Anglo-Saxon mindset, which is that somehow there's a war or there's a conflict or there's a competition. And here again, I want to differ with the mainstream idea. First, China doesn't threaten us. So it's not a war for survival. Yeah, China's powerful, but they cannot invade the United States. They cannot take over the United States. By the way, we cannot take over China. If we really got into it, and it's not impossible, one or both sides would blow up the world because we're in a nuclear age. This is something different from past history. We can't mess around the same way. We know that we literally can end humanity in a few hours, and this is a difference of our time from all previous times. Second is the mindset. It's been a Western idea for centuries, a very core idea that life is a struggle and it's a competition. And it's very interesting. The Western world, meaning in this case Europe, in historical time, was rather united 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in the West was defeated by Germanic invaders in 476 AD. After that, Europe never reunited. Europe became nation states in the end. Those nation states have basically fought with each other for 1,500 years. The idea of competition is profoundly set in the European mind. In China, there's something quite different. China's a vast continental scale, bigger than Europe in population by more than 3 times. And China did not fragment the way that Europe did. China has some natural geographic boundaries. On the north is the drylands. On the west is the Himalayan mountains. On the south is the tropical rainforest. And on the east is the Pacific Ocean. It's kind of a box. That box has been China for about 2,000 years. There have been episodes of civil war where it fragmented, but China has been together in a unified, administrative, centralized state for most of the last 2,000 years, something unimaginable in the Western world, and relatively self-contained. And as we talked about, China never was too interested in what was going on in the rest of the world, but China never invaded Japan, for example, not even once in 2,000 years, even though it was the bigger power. Once the Mongols invaded China and used that as a stepping stone to try to invade Japan in 1274 and 1281 AD. put that aside. That's a little footnote. The Chinese never invaded Japan. The Chinese never invaded Korea. The Chinese never invaded Vietnam. These are their next door neighbors in East Asia. Vietnam, one time, 1410 to 1426, if I have my dates correct. So 600 years ago. The point I'm making is, for China, the idea of, come on, we're not fighting anybody, is actually normal. People in the West can't believe this, but it's true. Our mindset is so much, oh my God, we have to compete with somebody. Whether it's the Germans, the Russians, the Chinese, we're at war. Now, there's another point, one more point I just have to bring up in the Western mindset. We have a kind of evolutionary mindset. We call it social Darwinism, which is, nations are at war. Some people have said, including Hitler said, races are at war. But there's a struggle for survival. That became a kind of scientific mantra in the 19th and 20th centuries to our huge disaster in the Western world. And the idea is, well, there's not enough living room. Somebody has to go. Somebody has to give. Hitler literally called for more Lebensraum, more living room in the East. He was going to take over the Slavic land so that the German people would have enough place to eat. So as an economist, I know this whole approach is completely wrong. We actually have enough for everybody in this world. We are not in a struggle for survival. We're not in a war to the end against China or Russia. And economics is not a zero-sum game. The whole world can get richer. It's not that I win, you lose, you win, I lose. It's not a zero-sum game. So I start with the mindset that, sure, okay, let's compete who has the best chatbot, who has the best AI. We can even compete who has the best electric vehicles. But that's market competition. That's okay. That's not competition for survival. That's not competition for security. That's not competition that we need an army about. That's kind of the fun competition of the Olympics. Who's better? Who can do better? Who can create something more attractive for consumers? Who can make their large language models more attractive? We take it, though, in the Western world as, who's going to win this competition? This is dire. We're going to lose. It doesn't even mean losing in economics, not military, but in economics. You can be behind, you can be ahead. It's true. If you fall so far behind, in the old days, you could be invaded. I can tell you something absolutely definitive. The United States will not be invaded in the continental United States in the 21st century unless we fall apart internally. Internally. We got, as even Donald Trump says, we got two great oceans. We've got 1,600 deployed nuclear warheads. We have 5,000 total nuclear warheads. China's not invading us. China is not a threat to us. Hutchinson operating a port facility in Panama is not a threat to the United States, however paranoid we want to get. So my point is, now I want to come to your real question, but I just wanted to preface it that I don't view this as this kind of competition to the end and who's going to win and who's going to lose, because real economics, in my opinion, is just not like that. Now, having said all of that, China's real good at a lot of things right now, especially at industrial production at the high end, because it's created over the last 20 years a remarkable ecosystem of production. And it's concentrated in a few places that are very, very strong. I visit them. There are a lot of good factories. There's a lot of good engineering. There's a lot of good technology. So they're doing a very good job. And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I was in Shenzhen, China, and I visited a robotics company. And it's pretty amazing, when you shake hands with these robots, and they're these humanoid robots, and they're about to come into our lives in a big way in the next couple of years. And Shenzhen alone has probably a dozen of these major producers of humanoid robots. I don't know who's going to win in the end in that competition, but they're doing a very, very good job. My own view is, you can throw on tariffs and other things, but that's not what this is really about. What this is about is hard work, a lot of innovation, a lot of smart young people, very clever industrial policy in China, by the way, which is they are investing with national plans. They didn't just come to AI. They made a national development strategy for artificial intelligence in 2017, and it's bearing a lot of fruit right now. We also have that kind of industrial policy, but we don't call it that. It's mostly Pentagon procurement in the U.S. case. So even Google started with, or Google companies had CIA, venture capital support. Not exactly. I don't want to be misunderstood, but there's a CIA linked IntelQ, which is a venture capital company for advanced technologies for security operations and so forth. And they've invested in Silicon Valley. Not quite in Google, it's debated, but in some of the companies that Google took over afterwards and so on. But our industrial policy is just directly a national security state issue. Right now, the Pentagon is teaming up with Palantir. It's teaming up with Elon Musk, with Starlink, with SpaceX, and so on. In China, they do it a bit differently, and it's got a lot more civilian side to it. It's got a lot more general economy, more, I would say, more kind of economic strategy making. We don't have economic strategy in the U.S. We have military and security strategy. Right. But the point is, China's become a formidable economy. We can put on tariffs, but that doesn't do what the president thinks it's going to do. That doesn't make innovation, strong companies. It basically is actually going to hand the world markets over to China, because China is going to be the low-cost producers of these technologies. America may build up a little bit more industry behind the tariff barriers, but they're going to be high-cost and uncompetitive.